I just always felt like an outsider. I went when I was in Forest Hill, it was an all Jewish school, like, and just being biracial, but still being Jewish. So I was like kind of connected to the kids, but like sort of distant.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. In recent decades, it has become fashionable among scholars of Jewish studies to refer to Judaism in the plural, Judaisms, recognizing the many ways of being and doing Jewish across a broad and complicated spectrum from secular atheist to ultra-Orthodox hyper-theist. No aspect of Jewishness is monolithic. In addition to variations in belief and practice, Jews are also multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multinational, and so on. A new book by today's guest brings this diversity to the fore.
We're delighted to chat with Liz Kleinrock, an anti-racist and anti-bias educator and author whose books include Start Here, Start Now, A Guide to Anti-Bias and Anti-Racist Work in Your School, Eyes That Weave the World's Wonders, Come and Join Us, 18 Holidays Celebrated All Year Long, and most recently, What Jewish Looks Like, a book for young readers co-authored with Caroline Kusin Prichard and illustrated by Iris Gottlieb. Liz, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Could you tell us about your own background and what led you to write What Jewish Looks Like?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I always explain myself in having a lot of different identities that are all happening all at the same time. So I am Korean, Korean American. I am Jewish. I'm a transracial adoptee, and I also identify as queer. So there's a lot happening all at once. But what I think is also really important to note, because sometimes people will assume, oh, like you must be half Jewish and half Korean, but it's like, nope, I am actually 100% all of these things all at once. And so growing up being Korean, presenting very much as Korean, I was pretty much the only person of color, anyone who just really didn't look like everybody else within my synagogue, my Hebrew school classes, other Jewish spaces that I was part of growing up, and including within my own family. Um, my adoptive family are all white or white presenting, Ashkenazi Jewish, and I stood out a lot. So that meant that growing up and even to this day, I heard and still hear a lot of, well, you don't look Jewish. And for a while, it's like, well, I don't really know what to say to that except for I am. And that sounds more like a you problem than a me problem at this point. But just getting very tired of hearing that and wondering why, there were so many misconceptions about Jewish people. And truly, like my own Jewish education was very, very limited growing up. I felt like I was constantly this square peg trying to fit into a round hole that I had to constantly prove my belonging and my worth. And it was really exhausting. And so this book, What Jewish Looks Like, is really meant to help readers, I would say, honestly, of all ages, because my dad thinks this is an adult's book that is presented as a kid's book, to really try to reflect on, interrogate some of the stereotypes and misinformation that a lot of people hold about Jewish people and the Jewish community on a global level.
I appreciate what you're saying about your background. I know growing up in a conventional synagogue as well, there was maybe one or two kids who weren't Ashkenazi, presenting white, etc. And, those are the kids I remember thinking back because they stood out, like you said. I think these days there is quite a bit more diversity in conventional synagogue settings because of intermarriage and other, conversions and things of that nature. Have you noticed sort of more people like you of a younger generation that maybe make you feel good?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I really started to notice it was actually when I moved to Los Angeles. I attended ECAR out there, and I got connected to a group called Jews of Color in Southern California. And I remember the first time, like, I went to a meetup and we did Torah study, and the experience of doing Torah study with a group of people who all identified as people of color and Jewish was, like, mind-boggling to me, and it was so cool. And certainly at the synagogue I now attend with my family here in DC, we definitely see more folks of color. There's definitely a lot more diversity along, many aspects of identity in our community. And there was also a study that was released a few years ago from the Jews of Color Initiative showing that I think somewhere between 10 to 12% of Jewish people do identify as people of color or multi-ethnic or multiracial in the United States. So demographics are also shifting too.
One of my pet peeves actually is this concept of the white Jew. I think that there's also kind of a pigeonhole or a box that Jews who present white paint themselves into. I know that there's the concept of passing and everything else that comes with skin color in the United States. But the notion of Jews being white at all kind of irks me. So when we get rid of that concept and then we open up to all of the other diversity and, like you said, Jews of color, etc., I think there's always been sort of, this diversity there. And I think Jews who even present as white don't realize that they aren't really white.
Because I think, like, even if we're looking at historical, like, Ashkenazi communities where people do present as white, and in these days, some Jews I know also just identify as white. I tend to use white presenting because in a lot of, like, workshops and presentations I do, there's always one or two people in the crowd who are like, "I'm not white, I'm Jewish." I'm like, "Okay, I personally don't care how you identify, as long as you own the fact that there are certain privileges and assumptions that come along with presenting as white if you are not identifiable as being Jewish out in public. So call yourself whatever you want, but own the privileges that you have." Um, I do agree with you also, and I think especially in the past year, there is so much misinformation and so many people who are not Jewish trying to tell Jewish people who they are and who they aren't. Because something also I think that fits into the realm of, like, square peg trying to be fit into a round hole is trying to categorize Jewish people racially along racial definitions and binaries that exist in the United States, because Jewish people are not a race, we're an ethno-religion. And Jewish people, despite all of that, have been racialized by others. And so being a racial group versus being racialized by other people and communities are two very, very different things. And have some Jewish people chosen to assimilate into whiteness? Sure. Those people also exist along so many different communities out there. But trying to say all Jewish people are white, as you said, like, inherently leaves out so many people.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
You're an anti-racist and anti-bias educator. In your view, why is it so difficult to address topics of racism, homophobia, ableism, classism, xenophobia, and the like in our classrooms?
In my opinion, it's not hard to do that. Adults make it hard. Kids don't make it hard. Kids are naturally inquisitive. They are so curious. They are often far more open-minded than adults. There is so much less unlearning that needs to happen in that process. So I personally don't think any of these topics are difficult to discuss. I think adults' biases and concerns and fears tend to dictate that type of climate. So in the work that I do as an educator, as a facilitator, I do work with students, and I also do a lot of work with adults. I lead a lot of professional development. Actually, like, right before this interview, I just came from leading professional development at the school I work at, which was an introduction to the history of disability and neurodiversity in our country, which is a topic that I think some talk about. Obviously, within those communities, it's, like, very well versed, but in mainstream spaces, like, not so much. Um, and I think that in order to have these really meaningful lessons and takeaways with students, like, we have to start with ourselves as adults, with our own identities, our own biases and misconceptions, and filling in those awareness gaps, because it's very hard to teach things that you also don't know, or you're not even aware that you don't know.
Yeah, I often think that parents are the problem. And also, being a parent myself, but also knowing that it seems these days that parents are a little bit too vocal and sort of dictating what is taught in schools. I don't remember that being the case. Maybe as a child, I wasn't aware of it, but it seems like it's kind of accelerated and exaggerated these days.
I think there's a lot of misinformation. And I think that oftentimes, at least like in my experience, a lot of the parents that I've encountered who I can like have conversations with, it's not so much of them not wanting certain topics to be even discussed or mentioned in class. It's more of concerns about how they're going to be talked about in class. And I think that's like a very valid concern because if you yourself have not done a lot of anti bias work or really thought a lot about your identity or your assumptions that you're bringing to your classroom, and then you try to jump into a conversation about anti Semitism and you don't know anything about Jewish people, you can actually do a lot of harm. So, some of these things I think are very valid, and others I think are very much not. Because I think adults, like most humans, tend to project a lot of their own assumptions and fears onto situations rather than approaching from a place of curiosity. Because I think if you were to, like, as a parent, ask most teachers, like, are you doing X, Y, or Z? They'll be able to give you some clarification about that. And so I think if you come in from a place of wondering and like wanting to partner and be able to support, you're going to have a lot more success. And if there are things that you don't want don't want your kid to like read about, for example, like then at home, like don't have them read about that. But that doesn't mean that you get to prevent everybody else from not reading about certain topics or learning about them.
In the introduction to What Jewish Looks Like, you note that the popular image of Jews in the US is light skin, curly hair, non disabled, with ties to European ancestry. We can also add cisgendered, heterosexual, and affluent. What makes these stereotypes so problematic?
I think obviously within the Jewish community, there are plenty of people who do fit these descriptors and identities, and that doesn't cover everybody. And some of the workshops that I do around, teaching about Jewish identity and also educating on anti-Semitism, if I asked you to close your eyes and picture somebody who is Jewish or picture, a Jewish person you know of, I would say probably 9 out of 10 times you're going to get someone who looks like, Jon Stewart or like Bernie Sanders or like Sarah Silverman or something like that. Um, and that leaves out so many people. I think some of it is very much confined to the types of representation we have in media in the United States. Um, Around the world, it can also look really different too, but this is typically like the type of identity and the descriptor that we see the most often when we're thinking about movies, TV shows, books, and things like that. Um, like any type of single story tends to be problematic because then it inherently still perpetuates marginalization of other people within that community.
Could you highlight a few people in the book to give our audience a little taste?
Well, since I just came off this training that I just led, Judith Human, who was such an advocate for disability rights, was also based here in DC, actually attended the same synagogue that my family goes to. Absolutely amazing, and she passed away a few years ago. We have people like Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, who is Korean American. She is a rabbi who leads Central Synagogue in New York City. She's absolutely amazing. We also have folks like Ruby Myers, who is Indian and Jewish, and she was like one of the most famous actresses in like the silent film era in India. So a lot of people out there, like really from all around the world too. It's been really wonderful getting to see people's reactions. There's been a lot of like the joy Caroline and I feel when somebody flips through the book and hearing every single time, like Taika Waititi's Jewish. Oh my gosh, like Daveed Diggs is Jewish. Like the reactions are absolutely spectacular.
I kind of agree with your dad. It is a kid's book because it's got wonderful illustrations and it's not super deep, each person gets a page. But it's also not a kid's book because I think, as we've been saying, adults need to be educated on this just as much. And there's still this kind of lack of awareness that maybe starts when we're young and continues when we get older. So getting the kids to become familiar with this subject at a young age, I think, is brilliant.
Yeah, there's a lot of front matter in the book, really wanting to tackle some of like the big questions that most people have, mainly based on misconceptions we hear a lot, like what does it mean to be Jewish? What's an ethno-religion? Are all Jewish people white? Like what's the Jewish diaspora? Really wanting to like front load as much of that information as possible to make the learning that happens throughout the rest of the book like even more meaningful. So really, really proud of that piece too.
The inclusivity of your book goes beyond racial, ethnic, and national diversity to include Jews whose Jewishness comes from different sources: adoption, conversion, patrilineal descent, and other ways of self-identification. How did you go about defining who is a Jew?
I feel like I've heard like rabbis give entire sermons on this, like trying to define like what does it mean to be Jewish? Who is a Jew? Okay, so I'm probably not going to do this justice, but I will do the best that I can. A Jew is any person belonging to this like worldwide historical global community through either descent, in my opinion, that can be through your mother's side or your father's side, or through conversion. I think a lot of it is about self-identification and also holding space for the fact that Judaism is a closed religion too. Like it's a closed practice. Um, but yeah, so through descent, through conversion, and also I think like from more of like my own personal perspective, um, this like added layer of something in your life, be it through culture or a religious practice that is continuing on these traditions that have existed for thousands of years. And that can look so different depending on who you are. For some people, like my parents attend shul every Saturday. I grew up keeping kosher. I don't do that anymore.
That's another misconception, by the way. Very few Jews are actually kosher.
And for others, it's, celebrating Hanukkah. Or for others, it's, going to Jewish delis like in your neighborhood or in your city. It can mean so many different things. And they're all beautiful and they're all valid. And of course, it depends upon like what denomination of Jewish you are. Because like my idea as somebody who originally grew up in a Reformed temple and then my family moved over to a conservative temple or probably have really different ideas than folks who identify as Orthodox or Hasidic. Uh, yeah, just depending on your level of observance.
The issue of who qualifies as a Jew is notoriously fraught. For example, the Pew Report of American Jews, which takes an expansive view, estimates the U.S. Jewish population at 7.5 million, while Israel advocacy groups, who use stricter definitions, in part to ensure that Israel appears to have the largest Jewish population in the world, tend to downgrade the U.S. Jewish population to 6 million or so. Perhaps looking at individuals as your book does, as opposed to playing with population statistics, is a better way to understand and explore Jewish identity. What's your view on this?
Okay, I think my view on this is like, why do people have to gatekeep? Like, why? Because I know that for those like advocacy groups or people who are defining what Jewish is through a much more narrow lens, to them, I wouldn't be a real Jew. Um, because I was not born to Jewish parents, because I'm adopted, even though I was raised Jewish, even though I grew up kosher, even though I was bat mitzvah and I was confirmed. Like I went to shul this past Saturday to watch my mom have an aliyah for her 75th birthday. Like I can read Hebrew. And to them, that's still not enough because it comes down to blood and lineage. And oh my God, like just do we not have enough to deal with already? Like people in this world with everything that's going on? I mean, truthfully, like, I will never forget when I was, going through confirmation, we, took a trip, like, my class, my cohort from Hebrew school, we went to, like, Hasidic Brooklyn because like, that's a fun place to go on a field trip. Bakeries are great, though, out there. But our tour guide was an Orthodox rabbi, and I was the only person in my class who looked the way I do, and I will never forget that he singled me out in front of everyone in my class and told me that I wasn't a real Jew and that I never would be. Um, I was like shocked and I was really hurt and like very heartbroken. And I think like in retrospect, even more upset that like the chaperoning rabbi from my synagogue didn't say anything. I remember friends of mine speaking up about it. But this guy was very adamant that I was not a real Jew and there was like nothing that could be done about that. And frankly, because it was at a Reformed temple, he probably didn't really see any of us as like really Jewish. I just think in like the scope of all of the things that are happening in the world, the amount of anti-Semitism that is out there, the amount of misinformation that's out there, like we need to have more things that bring us together. Like we have, I think, far more commonalities than things that divide us, as there are such bigger things at play. And we need each other. Like we need to build capacity. We need to have community because ultimately, like that is what has, I think, enabled Jewish people to survive and thrive for so many, like thousands of years. Um, Rather than saying, you don't meet this criteria or that criteria, so you're not really one of us. To me, it's just a waste of time.
I think it's somewhat ironic as well that the same people who are moaning and complaining, bitching, as it were, about intermarriage are also not accepting the children of intermarriage sometimes as Jewish, which would just grow the numbers, right? Intermarriage actually produces more Jews than endogamous marriage because of the just the exponential amount of pairings that we get when we're going outside of our people. So there's actually something really demographically powerful about this broadening of the Jewish community. And yet the people who complain or worry about Jews going away also aren't acknowledging the reality that there are actually Jews that you're not counting.
Yeah, well, I think they just mean like a particular type, right? Like there's a right way and a wrong way to be Jewish, and they just want like the right kind.
And the right kind is always my kind.
I do think though that we see that in a lot of different communities too. I mean, like being Korean as well, like I dated somebody for a while in college who was Korean, and like even though I am also Korean by blood but not by culture, like that wasn't good enough. Like this person's family wanted them to end up with somebody from like a nice Korean family, spoke the language, knew the customs and everything, and so there's always gonna be some loophole, like, there's always going to be someone or, like, some group of people out there where it's never gonna be enough, and I don't know, are we allowed to curse on here? I mean, you just did, so, yeah. Just, like, fuck them, like, it's just not, I think, a good use of time, and I think I used to spend a lot, like, way too much time trying to bend myself into fitting other people's ideas and expectations of me, um and from that, just, like, dealing with all these different layers of imposter syndrome, and then finally getting into therapy and, learning from my therapist, like, oh, like, the more space you take up when you're feeling that imposter syndrome, you're actually in a position to diminish it in somebody else who's gonna come after you because they're going to see you as an example, and they're going to know then that they belong because they have these other examples there.
What you're saying is very meaningful to me as a person who associates with Judaism via patrilineal descent. I also lived in Korea for a year and have a lot of affinity for the Korean culture. Do you think there's a lot of similarities between Korean and Jewish cultures?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. Um, Immigrant experiences, marginalization, and, like, I think a very intense connection to family and to ancestry and to culture, and an understanding that passing along and continuing these practices, like, that's what keeps us going. Um, and I think when you have been in situations like thinking about how Jewish people have pretty much been persecuted since we became a people. Um, Korea has also been invaded like thousands of times throughout history. And so when you're also constantly on the defense, as a community, I think that also cultivates like certain traits, behaviors, defense mechanisms. So I do definitely see some of those similarities too.
What do you hope readers take away from what Jewish looks like?
I hope they learn something. In my work, I talk often about the unlearning being just as important sometimes, if not even more important than learning new information. And so I hope that even like in the first few pages, people's biases like might be challenged a bit. I hope they are. I hope that people are open-minded when they read this and can approach it from a place of, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. Now this inspires me to go learn more." I hope it just sparks curiosity. I truly hope that this is like the beginning of a lot of people's educational journeys about Jewish people rather than, once you finish it like that being the end. Um, I hope it's also something that they want to share with people in their lives too. So if you're listening and you read the book, tell somebody about it, please.
And thank you so much, Liz, for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.